Hi. Does this work? Can I have a sign in the chat? Yes, awesome. Cool. Let's see, so if I share screen, share, cool. They just start the timer, awesome. Cool, yeah, so, yeah, thanks everyone for joining here and being safe and in the comfort of your home, hopefully. Yeah, so this talk is about, yeah, as the title says, about how can I, as a developer, take over someone else's code base. So I created this presentation because I have actually quite some experience with this. I've been working. I'm an ex-Novoda, so I've been working at Novoda. Some might know it. It used to be quite present at DroidCons in the past. So it's an agency that is, in Berlin and London mainly. And so I worked there for like between 4 and 5 years, and I had the opportunity to actually work on a bunch of different projects. I would change project pretty much every 6 months. So I had a lot of opportunity to actually switch code bases and take ownership of some of those. I'm now an Android engineer at TradeRepublic since the beginning of the year, and so I've been 4 months there. It's a startup which is located in Berlin, where I am as well, and it's a startup. So it's basically the Europe's first commission-free mobile broker. So it makes it really easy to actually invest in capital market. It's a really interesting app, quite heavy on the up-to-dateness, because basically, well, with market and stocks, you need to be always on your toes, right? We actually raised last week around 2. And yeah, of course, we're also hiring in pretty much every position. So if anyone is interested to move to Berlin and work with us, let me know. So what's this talk about actually? So I want in this talk to talk about what's been the main issue for me is I usually go on another code base, and I usually feel quite frustrated for various reasons. Because it's a code base you don't really know, because you expect it to be, of course, in a state that is not ideal. Because I mean, if it's not your code base, then you don't really have ownership on it. So you didn't shape it before. So it's obviously something that is going to be not in the state that you expect it to be. And then we can go over also a few strategies to how you can start and take over this code base and feel at home and feel productive, and to finish, yeah, then of course trying to make it better and to leave it in a better state that you found it. Oops, sorry. So first thing first, I think one of the most important thing is the mindset in which you go into this task, right? Because I mean, in an agency, I'm expected to jump in between projects, but this might happen that your boss asks you to like jump on a really old project that you already know is in a bad state, and that you really don't have the envy to actually to take on, because you know it's going to be a big task, you know it's going to be messy. Maybe it's only a code base that is like really old, or has been worked only with people with little experiences. So I try and really go into this experience with a positive mindset. By positive mindset, I usually think that well, it's probably going to be a challenge, if the code base is not in a good state, it's definitely going to be a challenge. I'm going to have a lot of fun refactoring. I actually now quite prefer refactoring rather than creating from scratch. I find the way you refactor way more interesting than just creating things from scratch. It's really interesting to just like take things apart and just make it better, right? So take everything as a challenge. And also, you're probably also going to learn about new domains. So when I was working at Novoda, I got to learn about like really random and various domains. I got to learn about cars. I got to learn about TV channels. What else I learned? I learned about baking. I learned about betting. I learned about selling. I really did went on like a really various domain. And then now that I'm working at TradeRepublic, I'm learning about trading and investments. So I went on the web and like most of us do every day, and I was trying to find quotes or like how do people actually deal with that, like taking ownership of a new code base. And I found a bunch of quotes, mainly on Hacker News, that actually are quite interesting and quite good. I think they reflect quite a bit what I think about it. And so there's this person saying, so my first rule for existing code bases is just because you wouldn't have done it the way they did doesn't mean they did it wrong, right? IT is pretty much like 0 or 1, like it works or it doesn't. But there's always like 1,000 ways to achieve the same thing. And because the person before you achieve that feature or solve that bug or wrote this piece of code way A, doesn't mean that because you would have done it way B doesn't mean it's wrong, right? As long as it works and it's in a shape that you can modify it and easily, then it's fine, right? So I think it's important to have this mindset of like, of course, probably wouldn't have done this way, but yeah, I mean, as long as it fixes the business issue, then that's fine. This one is also quite good. I think it's developer nature to look at a huge pile of code that someone else wrote and immediately think, this is a pile of, I can do better. So the first thing to do is rewrite all of this my way. And this last bit is my favorite, which just so happened to be the right way. I think especially when we don't really have much experience as developer, we tend to think that the code we write is the code, it's the right way of coding, because we don't have much experience, so we don't really know what else is out there and how to shape and write code in a maintainable way. So I think it's always good to take a step back and think that there's 99% cases where you don't actually need to rewrite a whole app. And the next quote kind of like continue on this, and it says that maybe you should also realize that after 3 years, that they have, as in the developer on the legacy code base, they have hopefully fixed a lot of bugs and got to a solution that is somewhat mature and better than what you can do in a week, right? And there's this one from Reddit as well that is maybe a bit harsh, but it highlights also what I was saying with developer being quite junior when they have this kind of statement of like, oh, this code base is awful and I could just like rewrite it in a week and have it in a better shape. Quick comic. Hopefully this is not how things end up for you. But yeah, hopefully this is a situation where that we never hit. But let's see what we can do even if we hit this situation. So I think one of the important thing when you inherit a code base. Sorry, I cannot see the chat, so I'm wondering if I'm still streaming. But yeah, awesome. Okay, so before starting coding away, I think it's really important to take a step back and have a good look at the code base. But not only the code base, not only just the pure code, but also everything that's around it. So there's of course like a different types and kinds of taking over. You can be alone, or with or without the original developer, or you can be part of a team that has a clue or no clue about the current code base. So I've been pretty much in every of those situations, because sometimes you just parachuted in a project. Sometimes you're alone, sometimes you have the original developer for a while that can help you get up to speed. And then after that is gone, or sometimes you also parachuted with a team of your own, or you're parachuted in a team that is already there. So all of these situations are like a bit different, but in the end, it's still rather the same, and you can apply the same strategies. So I usually start to look at the code. I usually so when I start to look at the code, I usually start with looking at crash reporting. So I usually start by looking if actually there is some kind of crash reporting in the app at all. Yes, happens to me a couple of times that there was no crash lytic or no, what's this day, Firebase. So first start with that. If there's not, then probably it's one of the first things you should add, because you have then no clue how the app is actually behaving in the wild. It's interesting to look at the numbers, but with a grain of salt, right? If you have 100% crash recession, it's usually a bad sign, because it might be just that the developer actually just try catching everything, which means that you're not even aware of what's breaking in the app, which is potentially the worst that can happen. So if you have a high crash-free session, but like not 100%, then it's usually a pretty good sign. And that's when I then jump to the app reviews. So you can have a look on the store. So the algorithm actually changed quite recently. So don't take my word for it, but I think nowadays how it works is it just do like a mean with the latest kind of review in the last weeks or month, instead of having this through the whole span of the app, which I think is a way better indicator of how the app is actually performing right now. So of course, high ratings is pretty good. And if the rating is a bit more low, then it's also interesting to have a look at what are the user complaining about. Is it the app crashing? Is it the app being slow? Which is basically your problem as a developer, and this needs to be fixed. Or are the user pretty much just complaining about their order not arriving, or I don't know what else, like feature A or B missing, which is still kind of your problem, but it's more a problem in the business as a whole. I have a quick look at the performance as well. So I play quite a bit with the app, see if it goes fast, if it doesn't crash. And yeah, just a quick look of how it behaves. Then it's quite interesting to have a look at the history of the code as well. Since how long the code base is existing, how many collaborators was there collaborating to the code, and yeah, gives you a bit of an idea of what to expect if the code base is like 7 years old, or if it's only like 6 months old. Have a quick look at the structure. So by structure, I mean more like in terms of modularization, I guess. Is there just a huge monolith? Is it an app that is so small that anyway doesn't really need any modularization? If there is modularization, is it by layers? I mean by layers, I mean app data, domain, views, this kind of stuff, or is it by features? I usually also have a look at God classes, which usually happens to be also the famous, or should I say the infamous base activities, base fragment. There's usually one of those in project, and it's usually to have an idea of the health of the code base. It's usually a good idea to have a look at those if they are filled with like random codes that are, I don't know, manipulating the permissions, or like trying to show a toast on every activity if there is a connection issue. Or the worst kind of thing I usually find in base classes is like navigation stack and things like that. So it's always a good indicator if you have a look at this. Yeah, and then the architecture. So I didn't put like any kind of architecture because I usually don't really care as long as there is and some kind of pattern that is applied the same way all over the application. So is there any kind of layering? Is there, I don't know, view models, presenter, data sources, repository, all those things? Or is it just a huge mess where everything is in the activity? Bonus point if like everything is kind of similar in the whole app, because it means that if you refactor one bit, you can usually then apply it all over the code base, which is always a nice plus. Have a look if there is any test. Hopefully nowadays there is. Is it unit test? Do you have UI test? It's a bit more rare on Android, but still happens. And what kind of layer it's touching? What's the overall code coverage? Is it like just one test there, or is it like, for instance, all the view models are tested, or this kind of things can also. It's usually a really good sign if it's test, because it means, I mean, on the condition, of course, that the tests are written properly, but it means that you have quite a bit of documentation, and it means also that you can refactor in a way that you feel a bit more secure about it. The CI setup as well. Hopefully, there's a CI setup. I see what is run when, and yeah. So yeah, usually I also it's quite overwhelming to go through a new code base. So usually I always write down stuff or question I have while going through, because it's really easy to get lost. It's really easy to click on something, being like, why is this there, and then going through the classes and being like clicking on something else and being, oh, actually, why is this there as well? And then you just forget what you were thinking about the instant before. So I usually write down all my questions, so then I have something I can refer to when I'm in contact with someone that can actually answer those. Is there any dev tools to make your life easier? So I don't know, for instance, on the dev build, is there like kind of any dev option that you can activate? It's always good to know about this, because if it makes your life easier, then that's bad. Then that's better, right? Have a overall knowledge about the external actors. Who are we relying on? Is there any kind of APIs with database? Is the API internal to your company, or is this relying on like external actors? How stable they are? This kind of thing is also a good thing to know before you start digging into the code base. Basic security. So by basic security, I mean, is there a pro-guarded in release? Do you have certificate pinning? Like just really basic stuff. The next one, the deployment process and existing level of automation is something that can bite you quite a bit if you don't think about this at the beginning, because you might just do everything and then be like, okay, now it's time to release, and then realize that you actually have no clue how the release process is supposed to work. And if the original developer is already gone, then yeah. So it's better to think about this at the beginning and have a clue how much manual process needs to be done to actually push a release. Because nowadays with the Play console, it's actually pretty easy to have something that is fully automated. It's quite nice. Having a high level overview of the dependencies. Always interesting to see if we are using like really old school back in the days dependencies, or if you're using like the latest edge in terms of dependencies, or if we are using like, I don't know, 10 different image loading library. It might be also a good indicator that we should do something about it. Also a vague idea of the dependency injection setup. Are we using Dagger, is it Coin, are we using just manual dependency injection? Or is it a free-for-all with singleton everywhere? It's usually, good to have a clue about that. And then, of course, while the code base owner is there, make use of him or her. Try and have always at the beginning a vague understanding of the whole system. You don't need to dive like headfirst into every single feature because it's always better if you have, let's say you have like ABC feature. It's always better if you have a vague understanding of ABC and you know overall what the app does, rather than having like a really deep knowledge about feature A, but like no clue about feature B and C. Because once the code base owner is gone, then it's usually gone, and then you're on your own to figure out what's going on. A good thing to do as well is to just, because it might be hard at the beginning to know which part is useful to really know in depth. So it might be also a good idea to just ask the code base owner, well, can you tell me which part of the app you think I should really know, because it's tricky to figure on my own. This person would usually know. Try to focus on the history of the code base. Try to understand why are the things the way they are, because history and context is usually hard to deduce from code or documentation, because code is not always well written. Documentation gets outdated really fast, and this is called the Chesterton's fence principle. It's like, so I think the story goes the following way. So it's in a forest, and then there's a fence in the middle of nowhere that seems to have no use. And there's this person who really wants to remove the fence because, well, it's not useful for anything, right? But if the fence is there in the first place, it's probably because there was a use at some point. So the owner of the park tell the person, like, well, I can remove this fence if you find out first why it was there in the first place. And I think it's like really something that we can apply in IT too, right? You have like this huge piece of code, you're not really sure what it's doing, but you think you can just really remove it because it's obviously not doing much. It's always good to know in the first place why it was there, because maybe nowadays it's not relevant, and it was relevant 3 years ago, but it might be still relevant today. So try to find out why things are the way they are before you refactor or remove them. Trying to put a bit of emphasis on this one. It's also good to try and stay kind. I know it can be really frustrating to get in a new code base because things are not the way you would like them to be, because maybe you find it awful, because maybe it's covered in bugs and it's just really a mess to go through. But it's always good to take a step back and understand that we are all humans here, right? And try to put yourself in the seat of the original developer. It's also important to have a good attitude in front of your computer, especially if you're working in the same room, right? I'm also I put myself out in this basket. It happened to me actually recently that I was just sitting in front of my computer and be obviously annoyed by a piece of code. And then the person who wrote the piece of code was in the room, right? So it's not a good thing to do. It doesn't make you feel better. It doesn't help in any way. So instead of having this kind of attitude, it's always good to just go to the person and ask politely to guide you through what's this piece of code doing and why was it implemented this way. I think it's also good to be understandable, right? Because we all have been in this situation where we had to take huge shortcuts because it was crunch time and this needed to go out tomorrow. And we are like, yeah, okay, it's fine, just patch it. And then tomorrow or the next week or the month after, then I have time and I can refactor it. And then 3 years later, then you still haven't refactored it, right? And then that's the time where you hand over this piece of code and you feel a bit ashamed about this. So we are all been in this kind of case. And yeah, I think we can all understand that. Right, so we look at the code. We enter the project with an awesome mindset. We look at the code. We now have a better idea. And now it's time to have an impact, right? So yeah, I would advise to not do a huge refactoring from the get-go. It's rather dangerous because you just like refactor a piece, like a code base you actually don't know. So the huge refactoring are actually a no-no when you just join a new project. You need to dive in a bit more into the code base, understand why the things are the way they are, and then you can plan and you can go through refactoring. It's the same with starting writing new code right away. Introducing breaking changes as well. It's always a bad idea to like just enter a project and be like, oh, let's just replace Eric's Java with coroutines now because that's the new hype thing to do. And then what I was thinking when I was talking a bit about earlier as well, the blame game doesn't really get you so far, right? You can blame the original developer or the people who wrote the code all the way you want, but at some point you just need to do it, right? You can be like, okay, what is this? What is that? But at the end, that's your job to have an impact on this code base and do modification or whatever is asked for you to do. Do understand the purpose of the system. So this is basically, yeah, play a lot with the app, try to understand what users are trying to achieve with the app, and get familiar with the domain. Learn about the processes. So this is more around the app, how things work, how an ID goes from being an ID to being implemented and shipped. Get to know the current architecture before you just like bulldoze the entire app and be like, this should be MVVM, and start introducing view models and things right away. The architecture in place might actually be quite good. So get to know it, and once you know it, then you can assert and start to make change. I usually start with a really small task, or really either really small task or small bugs or small refactoring task, where you already have code. So you don't need to write new code. You just need to modify code that's there. It's really interesting then to get to know about a bit the architecture and what was in the mind of the previous developers. And it's also a good way to write down questions and ask why the things are the way they are. And you might get some pointers. Get familiar with the language of the domain. So it's not always true. Like if you work on an app that has a domain that you know perfectly, then good for you. But most of the time, you might just end up, like for instance, working on an app about trading. I don't know much about trading, so I need to really get familiar with the language if I want to, to be efficient. Ask for help. This is something also I struggle quite a bit myself, but it's so much easier to just ask instead of trying to figure for hours or days why something is the way it is. Read if you're lucky enough and there's a wiki or some documentation, read it. Even if it's quite old, it can give you some insights into what was in the mind of the people who created the code base. Please do take your time. Please do not rush things. You might end up taking on a project and having to do modification right away. But then that's when the second point comes into the story. Do communicate your code base concerns to the stakeholders. So there's quite a bit difference between communicating your code base concerns and playing the blame game. It's fine to tell and to let know the stakeholders that the code base is not in the shape you were expecting, and that you need quite some time to be sure that you do things right. So this is totally fine, and please do it. It's way easier if the stakeholders are actually aware, rather than you trying to just smash some code and be done with it. Again, take notes on what needs to be looked at, addressed. I already talked about that. Find the right level of detail. Start with having a good understanding of the overall system, And when you start to write on actual features and details, then you can go down to the most little and parts of the app. The last point is I find quite interesting. When you start to work on a new code base, at the beginning you do some fixes, you get a good understanding. But at some point you also need to like create whole new features, right? And especially if you're in a team, you need to come to an agreement on how we are going to architecture those features. So if the code base is in a good shape, in a shape that your team and yourself are happy about, then maybe it's easy enough to just find a good example in the code base itself of how you and your colleagues want to create new features. But if the code base is not in a really good shape and you want to start actually introducing new architecture with a new feature, which might be a good idea, then it's a good idea to try and create a blueprint. And by blueprint, I just mean building the feature. So of course, already having a meeting probably with your colleagues, agreeing on what kind of architecture you want to use and all those details, maybe not too in details. And then one of you can just like actually implement the feature, open the pull request, and everyone can just comment on it. And then at some points, usually there's quite some comments. And then at some point you can just like agree on the last details. And the advantage of this is like the next time you actually need to write a feature, it's way easier to on the PR and regarding the comments to be, well, we agreed on that, so that's how I do it. And then of course you can iterate in the future. But it's already good to have a blueprint so people can go back to it and have a better clue of how they can implement something. Just having a look at the time. Cool. Do use the debugger. Hopefully you don't really need it, but I found it quite interesting, especially when I was going through like really spaghetti code bases, because sometimes it's really impossible to, especially when there's event buses that are used all over the place. It's easy to get lost, so I do use the debugger then in these cases. The second one is quite interesting as well. I usually also ask for a time budget on refactoring. The key on this is that you need to show that it has an impact and that you're just not like not doing anything 20% of the time or spending time on refactoring tasks that don't have really any impact. So you can show, for instance, that the test coverage is going up, that you have less dependency, the app is smaller, or that you feel this one is not really a metric, right? But it might be good enough that you feel more confident in making the changes. Also, if the app is more stable, of course. Try and focus on the worst parts. If you just focus on everything that you feel is bad, it's just a never-ending, quite stressful endeavor. So just try and focus first. Prioritize and focus on the worst part first. The rest can always wait. This is a sad truth, but this is a truth. There will be always something that needs to be addressed. The code base is never going to be fully migrated to something you're fully happy with. And even if it does, then it might be quite boring, no? So yeah, expect also to write quite some glue between both worlds and yeah, test, refactor, and repeat, basically. Okay, we are finally getting to the actual Android specifics, because for now this talk was quite general. Yeah, just look at the chat quickly. Oops, where's my? Yeah, cool. Still going on. Awesome. I haven't talked in the void for 20 minutes, so that's good. Android specific. So I don't know if it's still possible to, or actually it is. I've been in a project recently where it's still a sync task. So have a quick look at what would be nowadays considered deprecated and or dangerous. Do people still use instant tasks? Do you have like a lot of handler doing post delayed that might lead to leaks, for instance? I also quite like to go through the @deprecated warnings in the IDE. Give me an idea of if we're using a tons of deprecated APIs. You might also end up in projects where the previous developer was super into bleeding edge experimental stuff, and have like a whole bunch of things that are written a bit with coroutines and a bit with RxJava, and then some live data sprinkle on top of it, and then just kind of like in a corner. And then you have all these extra dependencies and doesn't really bring anything. So that might be a good idea to refactor those and get rid of this extra weight. And the state of the modularization as well. Because I think nowadays the community is quite in sync with the fact that, especially now that we have these dynamic feature modules, gives us a direction into like modularizing. Modularizing by features, but you can still encounter people that modularize, for instance, by layers, which is quite neat, because then you have this like really clear separation, but it also means that you don't really get any of the advantages of modularizing by feature, because if you modularize by layer, then you might, for a feature, end up just touching all the layers, which means that every time you just recompile the whole app, whether when you actually modularized by features, then you just recompile the actual feature module that you just touched, which saves you quite some time. Do some little incremental changes. So as I was mentioning earlier, I really like those base classes, because it's usually where you can have the biggest impact, and you can extract little collaborators from there. So yeah, the usual composition over inheritance. I'm quite a fan of the activity callback for those, because then you can really extract those little piece of logic you have in your base classes using those, because that's usually what you want. Also, in terms of modularization, it's usually quite hard to modularize from the get-go, especially if you have like a huge monolith. But you can start simple by just creating new modules when you create new features, which also gives you quite some pointers into what would be actually hard in terms of continuing the modularization later by extracting stuff from the monolith. Do synchronize between platform. Also, usually it's Android and iOS. So it's usually also a good idea to have a look with the iOS folks and see how they do things. Okay, I'm going to go a bit faster. Yeah, I'm going to mention the component activity, which I'm quite excited about. It has this lifecycle observer. I think nowadays probably all of you should be aware of this, but it's basically also a way of extracting thing out of the whole activity fragment, because then you can have like nice little class that are lifecycle aware, and you can just plug it. They recently also released the on-backpress dispatcher, which helps also having some nice little extracted logic for the whole on backpress in the activity, instead of having always this piece of code somewhere over there. And then this is alpha, but there's also a component to handle the activity result, which I'm quite excited about. Okay, I'm going to skip that. And then, yeah, to finish the boycott rule, I think it's also really, I mean, because the project you just inherited, right? I don't think you're going to die with it, right? You're going to at least at some point just like give it back to another team. So I think it's also important to think about how much you struggle taking over this project and just making it nicer for the others. So it's time to give back to the next person. Think about how you can make it better so the next one can hit the ground running. Please clear commits. I'm still finding some code base like huge bug war 2. It's not really helpful. Ticket number help quite a bit as well if they are linked to the Jira, for instance. Please some explanation for the obscure acts as well. We always have to do obscure acts because it's Android. But at least if there is a little comment that explain it, that's quite helpful. Yeah, and take note about what was missing when you took over, and just fill in the gap. Zusammenfassung, or conclusion in English, conclusion en français. Taking over is a hell of a challenge in a good way. I find it really interesting, to be honest. Do not approach it as a core, but really as a challenge. Do not rewrite the entire code base, at least at first. Do take your time, it takes time. Do make it your own with little incremental changes, and please leave it better than you found it. Any question? So I think I need to go to the Slido thingy. Let's see. Oh boy, that's quite some questions. Cool. So the first one is, should I share my screen? Probably yes. Oh, I can just put my face. So how do you balance between leave the code base in the beta state and keep yourself from rewriting, refactoring it because it works? How do you balance between leave the code base in the beta states and keep yourself from, Yeah, that's a good question. So it also all depends on how much pressure you have to actually deliver things, right? So I usually take a lot of notes about things I found that are not great. And then whenever I have some time in between getting to know the code base and actually shipping features or fixing bugs, then I prioritize those. Which one I feel are the most, I usually start by which one are actually a danger for the code base, which one can be like, make really the app crashes a lot or be a really bad experience for the users. And then I will have the one that could make me more productive if I was refactoring this this way. But yeah, it's not an easy task. I think it's somewhat something that comes with experience as well. I also definitely at the beginning had this urge of just like refactoring everything, which can end up pretty bad. So just really always think about, take a step back, try to see if it's really that important right now to do this, and if it is, just plan it properly and don't just go straight up into it head first. That would be my advice. The second one from Xavier. Do you have tips for developers who will leave a team and be replaced to make the onboarding easier for the one who will take over? Yeah, that's actually a pretty good question. So this one, usually, so this is not something I was doing before, but that's now something I constantly do when I take over a code base. Is I take all my notes and I try to think also about what would be helpful once I leave it, because that's something I didn't know, and that really helped me into understanding better the code base. But if you don't have this, I would think try and put yourself in the shoes of the person who's going to join. What are all these little details that you think are not that obvious and that could help this person on board? The best thing you can do is to be present when the person on board, and to do quite some pair programming with that person, at least at the beginning. I found pair programming to be really, really helpful. So yeah, if you don't really know, also writing more documentation, definitely. But I think the pair programming session is probably the best bet here. So Raymond, how do you cope with pressure from stakeholders that pay you to deliver the promised new features? Yeah, so that's one of the issues as well, right? So that's what I mentioned when you need to make clear to the stakeholders your concerns, being like, so I just inherited this code base. I do need to I do need to do the change you ask for. But because X, Y, and Z, it's probably going to take more time. And if I just skip it, then this is going to happen. Like if you want me to deliver this tomorrow, then I don't have much knowledge about the code base, and this is a danger because X, Y, and Z. Because I don't know much about this part of the app, so maybe I can make it less stable. So it's always a balance, right? And I think it's probably one of the hardest things, but you need to make aware the stakeholder that that some refactoring is needed, or that at least you need more time. Otherwise, you probably will break something. I don't know if I have. Actually, I'm over time, I think. Yeah, I'll happily join. I think they probably created a channel for me. So if you guys can, if your peeps can just go in the channel and post your question, then I'll be happy to answer them. Sound good? Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Bye-bye.